I'm a guy, and let people believe I was raised in care because I was abused when in fact I had a great childhood, except that my mother tried to raise me as a girl. Background: I'm a guy in my late 20s who was taken into care aged 7. Everyone around me already knows that I was brought up by foster families because I had a shit early childhood. I deliberately keep it vague and say stuff like, I'd rather not go into it, so that people will just assume I was abused in some way and they'll stop asking about it. The truth is that for the first 7 years of my life, I was brought up as a girl by my psycho birth mother, who really wanted a daughter and didn't let the snag of giving birth to a boy stop her from trying to raise one. She was a pretty successful professional in a legal field, not entirely sure what, and had me via anonymous sperm donor from a fertility clinic. She found out I was a boy at a late ultrasound and then moved across the country. Gave birth to me at home and continued to move about until I was 5 or so. It was just the two of us all my life. We had contact with other people, of course, but they rarely got very close. I had lots of friends, but was always supervised. I found out way after that my mother's strong puritanical Christianity was a lie. She used to explain why she was so strict about me being private and never letting anyone see me get changed or anything. I just accepted all of this as fact, having never been told anything different. I was sent to a religious school for girls and had a really great childhood. I was a bit of a tomboy and played with Lego and toy animals rather than dolls and stuff. But that's not unusual, and no one ever questioned I was a girl, even me. I knew about men and women, but had never really seen much of naked people. My mother never ever spoke to me about it, but I kinda had the impression that when I grew up and got boobs and stuff, my dick would kinda fall off or something, and I would be a woman, and other kids would keep their dicks and they'd be men. I don't know. To be honest, I never really thought about it. Anyway, I carried on with my happy girlhood and had a bunch of friends and everything was great until I was 7, and a teacher accidentally spilled a cup of hot coffee over me at school. The liquid soaked through my clothes and was scalding me, so the staff immediately stripped me out of my dress and underwear to get the hot coffee away from my skin. And then they found out. The cops were called and I got taken to speak with who I guess would be social services. They asked me a bunch of questions about life at home and stuff. Meanwhile, my mother was taken in for questioning too. She refused to acknowledge me as male and insisted I was her daughter. Because she was, delusional and stuff, I wasn't allowed to go back home but got put with a foster family and went through loads of therapy and stuff. The worst part was that literally overnight I lost everything. My mother, my home, all my toys, all my clothes. I moved school so lost all my friends. They cut all my hair off and told me I wasn't a girl anymore. It was really traumatic. The first foster home wasn't that great. They had 3 boys already, and going from a sheltered, religious-only child upbringing to a rough-and-tumble, testosterone-filled environment was really difficult. They tried to force me to a masculine, and I was just too confused about what they wanted. Anything girly was reprimanded, and I felt so lost and alone because nothing I did was right. I tried to commit suicide when I was 11, and again at 13 because I didn't feel I fitted in anywhere. After the second attempt, they moved me to a different foster family who were awesome. I consider them to be my parents. They actually stood up for me. The first thing was that they let me grow my hair. From when I got taken into care, they buzzed my hair short, and I hated it. They always had to hold me down and do it forcibly while I was crying and fighting. My new parents flatly refused to do it and said that loads of boys had long hair. They also let me quit karate and football and take up swimming and jazz dance. Since I'd been in care, no one had ever stood up for my right to choose what activities to do or how to dress before. It was amazing. In the end, I came out of it with a pretty healthy gender identity. I'm a guy, but not the most butch guy ever, but I'm fine with that. I went through school and got my degree and have a pretty good job and an amazing, supportive wife. Everything looks great, but I can never speak about my early childhood and how I grew up as a little girl. After my grandfather on my mother's side passed away, my mom, her sister, and my 2 uncles pieced together a bit of family history wherein they came to the conclusion my grandfather murdered a child molester who was eyeing my aunt, who was the baby of the family at the time, only 6 or 7, on school grounds and trying to get her into his car on multiple occasions. My grandfather drove her to school one day. It was a Friday, and asked her to point out the man who'd been doing this. She did. And that weekend, Grandpa and a close family friend had organized a little getaway for the family, up the coast, to the beach, which was very random. At a rest stop for gas and snacks, my uncles, 8 and 10, 11, saw a bundle under their seat in the back, and when they unrolled it, they found a machete covered in viscera. My younger uncle didn't understand what he was seeing, but the older one knew it was some dangerous adult business and wrapped it back up. Made him swear not to say anything. They get to the beach late Saturday, and before anyone gets out, Grandpa and the family friend have to do something first, and they grab a big carpet roll out of the trunk, grab the bundle from under the seat, and carry it up the shoreline past the rocks and such. A while later they came back, took the family to a hotel for the night, and spent most of Sunday having fun at the beach. As adults now, my mom and her siblings were shocked, each contributing some small piece to this whole story, never knowing about the whole thing until then. Finally, my grandmother chimed in and said that Grandpa was not a man who trusted the police to do anything about anything and just shrugged. I only really feel comfortable telling this now as both grandparents, my aunt and my mom, have all passed away. Only my uncles are still kicking. My paternal great-great-grandfather paid for my great-grandmother and her family to be murdered so he could take the kids, my grandpa and his 3 sisters. He came from a wealthy family and my great-grandmother didn't. So it turned into basically a blood war to kidnap the children. Well, turns out the man my great-great-grandfather paid was a friend of my great-grandmother and her family, and told them about the plans to have them murdered and take the children. So they were able to leave overnight and escape without a trace. They went into hiding until my great-great-grandfather died, and they were finally able to reunite with my great-grandfather. But by this time, the kids were older and had little to no relationship with him, and the relationship they did was incredibly hostile. My grandpa moved to the United States when he was an early teenager with his sisters and my great-grandma, primarily to get away from my great-grandpa, but that didn't really work, since he ended up following them. My dad and his siblings ended up having a relationship with my great-grandpa that wasn't well received by my grandpa, but great-grandpa insisted. Despite everything, my great-grandpa never had any other kids and left all of the family money, land, etc. to my grandpa, being the only son. My grandpa didn't want anything to do with it and sold it off. We're like 99% to the cartel in Mexico because the deal was crazy, shady, and we were pretty sure the land was already being used as a cover for the cartel anyway. Grandpa also is very hush-hush about how he has had so much wealth in his life. I'm sure he'll take that to his deathbed. My grandfather was a pedophile and molested his biological daughter, my mother, starting as a young girl. This continued into her marriage to my father and resulted in her using illicit drugs as a coping mechanism. I'm not sure if it was the drugs or if she was just tired of dealing with the demons this caused, but she ended up committing suicide in front of me at age 4. My grandfather, worried that the OSBI would discover the root cause of her suicide, tried to convince law enforcement that it was not suicide and that I had murdered my mother. Thankfully, forensic testing confirmed the cause of death as suicide. To make matters worse, my 2 younger sisters and I ended up living with him after my father's death. True to form, he began molesting one of my sisters shortly after we had moved in. I did not realize at the time that my grandfather was a pedophile and had no idea my sister was being molested. She told me about it years later, after he had already passed. It was at this point I began looking into our family secrets. I learned my grandfather had raised another set of grandchildren before us and had molested one of the girls then too. The entire family apparently knew about the situation and chose not to notify authorities or take any action to help the children. I suspect they also knew he was molesting my sister for several years while we lived with him. When she was dying, My great-grandmother confessed to my grandmother that she was the reason great-grandpa died at 48 years old. The doctor blamed it on a heart attack brought on by heat stroke and the malaria he'd contracted as a younger man. Great-grandma says that the morning of his heart attack he'd been snippy with her, so she put rat poison in his coffee cup. She thought better of it and dumped it out before serving him coffee that morning, but she didn't wash it out and, well, it doesn't take a whole lot of arsenic to kill a man that's already got malaria. Bonus story, not a deathbed confession, but when I was about 11, we found out that my dad, who had always been an only child due to grandma having a hysterectomy shortly after she married my grandpa. We got a story about crazy murderous great-grandma telling grandma she's put both my dad and my aunt in the ground if she didn't give my aunt up. Important note, grandpa is her second marriage, and the first marriage was supposedly to my dad's biological father, and that surrendered because her first husband didn't want kids and apparently didn't know how sex worked. Well, our aunt shows up and my wonderful and understanding grandfather accepts her immediately while saying, "I always wanted a daughter," and you'd think that level of honest, unconditional love would encourage a loosening of the tongue. But grandma didn't say anything further. Aunt is 3 years younger than dad. Grandpa married grandma when my dad was 6. When I was 20-ish, an uncle that's a year older than dad shows up, and I don't know what the story was because that uncle had problems, so he wasn't welcomed like my aunt. However, grandpa still loved her and forgave her for the secret. Grandma could have taken this moment to say something, but grandma and grandpa both died during the pandemic, and that's when uncle number 2 showed up, 1.5 years younger than dad and 1.5 older than aunt almost to the day, but wait, there's more. See, when he married grandma, grandpa was working for a company that had him traveling a lot, so he was rarely home until after that big medical scare that resulted in grandma's hysterectomy before they ever had a chance to start a family of their own. The hysterectomy's name is Paul, final uncle to show up, and we only know that he was the hysterectomy because his birthday is 2 days before her discharge paperwork that she kept in a box of important documents, and from Paul himself. He waited until grandpa's death to reveal himself, but he'd been a member of grandma and grandpa's church and a family friend for a few decades. Grandma cheated on grandpa while he was traveling and fell pregnant. That poor man never would have done the math and realized he hadn't been home for conception, but grandma wanted TK protect herself. She went to a local doctor and his wife, who had been having very public troubles conceiving, and made an offer. If he would state she had some sort of medical reason and perform a hysterectomy when she went into labor, they could keep the baby. My dad was a single child with 4 siblings. My grandmother dated a federally watched wanted drug lord. In her late 60s, she dated Bud. He was a large guy who bragged about being in Jimmy Hoffa's crew the day he disappeared. My grandmother is retired, living on a pension, nothing special. Starts dating this guy in Waveland, MS. One day she walks in and sees him standing there with this open suitcase of cocaine or heroin or something, and he just beats the shit out of her, puts her in the hospital. When my mom and her sister and my dad go to the locals, they don't know his actual name but know his address, and he's Bud. Local police look up a few things to figure out who this is, and they describe him based on the info on the screen, and within a few minutes a supervisor comes in saying they can't be there and can't be talking about this guy. But the initial officer is shocked someone like this is in their jurisdiction. Dad works with a retired Secret Service agent and asks if he can make a phone call to find out who this guy is and what he's up to. 2 days later, a pair of FBI agents walk into my dad's office to ask why he's asking about Bud. They tell Dad, don't involve himself or pursue it anymore. Bud died about 2 years later, grandmother 3 years later. We still don't know who he was or what the scope of what was going on around us. Default text mom and dad did the genetic match thing. IDK if it was 23 and me or one of the others. Years later, my mom got an email out of the blue. A young woman said she'd grown up in foster care after having never known her dad and being taken from her drug-addicted mom. She was now happily married with 2 daughters of her own and wanted to find her dad, so she did the same service and got a near match in my mom. I don't recall the deals, but basically her dad had to be a nephew of my mom or something close to that. Well, there was only one male in my mom's family that was the right age. Deciding what it wasn't her secret to keep, my mom told the woman about her nephew, my cousin. Turns out that while he was engaged to his current wife, he'd been banging this other woman. It eventually came out that he had known he'd gotten her pregnant. It wasn't a one-night stand, and had immediately bailed. He refuses to this day to acknowledge her. His wife stood by him. But the real kicker? About a year after the revelation, the cousin's daughter got married. My dad had just started to get sick, so he and my mom couldn't come, so I flew from California to Ohio, and my sister flew from Maryland to attend and represent our family. You know how traditionally you invite out-of-town relatives to attend things like the rehearsal dinner? Yeah, we were basically persona non grata, because my dear cousin and his wife were absolutely terrified we'd reveal their big secret, which they were keeping from their kids. They were dead wrong. We'd both agreed that we weren't going to be those kinds of assholes who ruin this other person's wedding. But of course, there couldn't be an actual discussion about it. Fast forward another few years, and the daughter who had gotten married calls my mom. She and my mom had always been close, but she was absolutely livid because she had just found out about this other person out there claiming to be her half-sister, and that my mom had apparently been the one to start the rumors about her dad. Of course, what had really happened is that she'd learned the truth, but to this day, this call was now 4 to 5 years ago, she hasn't spoken to my mom again. And the real surprising, not surprising bit? The cousin, the dad in all of this, is the most virulently racist person I know. I'm sure it'll be a shock to learn that a white guy who grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, could have possibly turned out that way. But if you're following along, you already know the punchline. The daughter he refuses to acknowledge is black. The good news is that I got a very cool new family member out of this. She's awesome, way better than any of the kids my cousin had a hand in raising. And she has a daughter who is precisely, to the day, the same age as my son. Growing up, I always felt like there was something off about my family. Conversations would suddenly stop when I walked into the room. My grandmother would start to say something, only for my mom to shut it down with a sharp look. I figured it was just normal family drama until my great-uncle's deathbed confession changed everything. He was in hospice, barely conscious most of the time, but when I visited, he grabbed my wrist out of nowhere. His grip was weak but urgent. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to kill him. I just froze. I had no idea what he was talking about. His eyes were watery, but he held my gaze. I never told your grandmother. She would have never forgiven me. I asked him what he meant, but he was slipping in and out of it. Eventually, he mumbled something like, "We were just kids," before closing his eyes. He never woke up again. After the funeral, I asked my mom if she knew anything. She went pale. Then she sighed like she had been holding something in for years. Apparently, when my great-uncle was a teenager, he and his older brother, my grandmother's brother, went swimming in a lake near their childhood home. They were messing around, shoving each other, when something went wrong. My great-uncle pushed him too hard, and he hit his head on a rock beneath the water. He went under and never came back up. The family always said it was just a tragic drowning. No one ever questioned it. My great-uncle had lived his whole life carrying the guilt, never telling a soul. I don't know if it was really an accident, or if, in some heated moment, it was something worse. All I know is that he took the truth to his grave, and now I'm the only one who knows. Thanks for watching. If you want more Reddit stories with a real voiceover, leave a like and comment, "I like big bananas." If you think we have a team at work on a big few project, so it would be interesting to see who would like a slight change in format. All the best, see you next time.